I'm Sandra Dimas, co-host of 2819, which is a television production of Reasons to Believe. And I'm joined today with Dr. Fazale, Rana, and George Haraksin. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
So just to give some background, Fuzz, you are a biochemist and you're also an author of numerous books, including Thinking About Evolution, 25 Questions Christians Want Answered, and also Humans 2.0, Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Perspectives on Transhumanism. Whew, I got it all out there. So you're going to be speaking from that perspective. And George, you are a senior adjunct professor of philosophy and ethics at Azusa Pacific University, and you're also a former pastor, having pastored for over 20 years. So you're going to be bringing that perspective with you to this important conversation. So this conversation is going to be about something that's on everyone's mind, and rightfully so. It's the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, Fuzz, you recently wrote an article on the COVID-19 vaccine and God's providence, and that generated a ton of questions coming in through Facebook, not only on your Facebook, but also on RTB Official's Facebook. So what we wanted to do is just kind of answer those questions in one fell swoop, make it a nice long video, and just tackle some of those questions. So let's dive in. You guys ready?
I'm ready.
Awesome. All right. So the first question, and we've got to tackle this before we tackle anything else. It comes in from one of our readers, and they say, how do we know that COVID-19 is even real? So Fuzz, can you take this one on?
Yeah, well, many people think of COVID-19 as a respiratory disease, but actually it really is a disease that impacts our entire bodies because of the distribution of the cell surface receptors that the SARS-2 coronavirus binds to. So it's a disease that not only affects our lungs, but affects our digestive tract, our circulatory system, even our nervous system. So it's a much more broadly impacting disease than is something like the flu. People are tempted to compare COVID-19 to the flu, but that really is not a good comparison, not only because of, the progression and the impact of the viral infections, but also because of the severity and the lethality of COVID-19. We've had COVID-19 with us for about a year in the United States. And in that period of time, 5 times more people have died from COVID-19 than they've died from the flu in the last 5 years. And right now, COVID-19 is the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And the estimated death toll in the U.S. for COVID-19 is on the order of about 400,000 plus individuals, with sadly that number most likely rising by several 100,000 more before we hopefully bring the pandemic under control. So they're not the same. The COVID-19 and the flu is not the same. It's a real thing. COVID-19 is a real thing.
Right. Wow. So you said that in the last 5 years, the number of people who have died from the flu equates to how many people have died in 1 year with COVID-19?
More people have died.
More people
from COVID-19. So this is serious business.
Yeah. So it's real. So I'm glad we're establishing that. Another question that comes in, there's also the problem of not differentiating between people who died with the virus and those who died from the virus. So what's the distinction, and is that important here in this discussion?
Yeah, well, about 83% of the people that do die from COVID-19 actually have what are called comorbidities. They have other health issues. But 17% of the people that have died from COVID have died with COVID being the only morbidity that they essentially experienced. Now, the thing is with the comorbidities, it's a little bit tricky because when somebody dies, they will record all of the morbidities for the CDC that person has. And so if they died with diabetes and also with COVID, it'll be recorded as, again, a death that involved both morbidities. But the problem here is that those morbidities from, those comorbidities associated with COVID-19 are actually not contributing immediately to that individual's death. That individual died because they had COVID-19, and because they were suffering from these other conditions, they were much more vulnerable to COVID-19. So I think it's appropriate to think of COVID-19 still as the cause of that death. But just to give a little bit of perspective on these numbers, the CDC actually reports something called the excess death rate. And so this is the number of people that die in a year's period of time or some given period of time that exceeds the average expected death rate. So if you go and look at the death rate from average death rate for the years 2015 to 2018, and then you look at what the death rate was in 2020, it's about 500,000 as the excess number of deaths in the United States. About 400,000 are from COVID. Another 100,000 are probably because people are not able to get adequate medical care because the medical systems are overwhelmed with COVID patients. So, or somehow making COVID-19 appear to be more deadly than it actually is not really the right way to think about those numbers.
Right. Thank you for that. That is certainly jarring to think of those numbers. So, George, we're going to get to you in a second. I have one more question for Fuzz as we talk about the vaccine. So one of the questions that came in is that there's really not a need for a vaccine, that the death rate is so low. Now, I think you've established that it isn't. And there are effective treatments. I feel much safer just catching the virus to get my antibodies than taking this vaccine. So how is this vaccine less risky than catching the virus? And exactly. And then what gives me confidence that it will even work? So kind of a lot to unpack, but yeah, basically our bodies can handle it and we don't need the vaccine.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully that, a couple of things about COVID that I think are really good news is number one, a number of people can have COVID-19 and not have symptoms. They are asymptomatic. That's a good thing. Or people can get COVID-19 and they have a relatively mild case of it. Again, that's a really good thing. The death rate is actually relatively low, and it has dropped over the course of the last year because medical practitioners have figured out how to manage more severe cases of COVID-19. So these are all really good things. But because even with a death rate of 1% or 2%, because there is not herd immunity, essentially what you're looking at is a 2% death rate potentially for 330 million people. And so that actually translates into a fairly large number. So the fact that there's not herd immunity means even a very low death rate is concerning. And as the number of cases are surging, it means hospital systems are overwhelmed, so that even though we know how to treat COVID-19 in the severe cases, we're not able to do that because people can't get access to health care and the effective treatments that are now available. Another thing to keep in mind is that we don't know what the long-term effects are of COVID. So 1 in 10 people that get COVID develop what's called long COVID, which is a persistence of some pretty severe symptoms that can go on for months and months and months. And the concern is they may even persist for years. There's also new data coming from the UK saying that 33% of the people that have been hospitalized with COVID 3 to 4 months later are readmitted to the hospital with either severe cardiovascular issues, liver disease, or with a severe case of diabetes. And of those, about 10 to 15% actually die. And so the problem here is that there are these long-term effects that we're just beginning to see. So, this idea of rolling the dice and just getting COVID and thinking that that's going to give you the immunity, instead of the vaccine is really not a good approach, because you very well could be one of those people that suffer from long COVID or have to be hospitalized and maybe later rehospitalized. You may actually be playing with your life, taking your life into your own hands. Mm-hmm. And this idea that COVID-19 is a disease for older people that, again, have comorbidities isn't completely true. We are now beginning to see COVID in young children, right? There's this thing called multi-inflammatory syndrome that is beginning to show up in children. There's over 100 cases that have been reported in the Los Angeles area. This is a very severe problem that young children face. The average age for hospitalizations in the United States is under 40 years of age, And of those people that are hospitalized, about 20 to 30% will be in intensive care. Another 10% of those hospitalized will have to go on ventilators, and about 3% die. So this idea that somehow getting the COVID-19 is better than the vaccine is really not the right way to think about it, because you really are rolling the dice. And plus, if you get COVID-19, you can also infect other people. You can transmit it to other people who may be, again, highly vulnerable people. So to me, the vaccine gives you the immunity without experiencing COVID-19 or putting other people at risk of contracting COVID-19 from you.
Right. And I think that's such a good point, because you've got the asymptomatic version, which means like I could be fine and I've chosen to roll the dice, but you know what? My grandmother hasn't chosen that, and I go visit her not knowing I have it, and she can't handle it, you know. I think you were going to say something, George.
No, I was just going to ask a clarifying question. I'm a philosopher, and so certain language I pick up on. I think when I hear you say, well, you're just rolling the dice, that can make it sound like what exactly are the probabilities that you're talking about? Because there's different levels of probabilities depending on what you're exposed to in different contexts. So when you use that phrase, what exactly, we might want a little bit more clarification of what you mean there.
Well, in other words, I don't know what the probabilities are precisely, right? And I'm sure that the statistics are there to say of, people that get COVID, a certain percentage are going to, be asymptomatic, a certain percentage will have a mild case. We know that 1 in 10 people will get long COVID. We know there's a certain percentage that will be hospitalized, but you just simply don't know whether you're going to be that person or not, what category you fall into. I don't think, I think the perception that we have about COVID-19 is not the reality. And unfortunately, that perception was shaped in the very early days of the pandemic outbreak, when we thought it was primarily a disease that impacted elderly people who had comorbidities. But as it's now spreading into communities at large, and we see much more widespread cases, we're realizing that this is a much more severe disease than we thought, and we can't really predict who's going to actually develop mild cases, long-term cases, who's going to be hospitalized. It's a complete unknown. So you can't operate under certain assumptions that because you're in a demographic group, that if you get COVID, it's going to turn out well for you. I think this is some of the problems that we're seeing with the surges, is that young people, particularly when they went back to college, thought we're invulnerable. It doesn't matter if we get COVID. And so they were holding these, parties and large gatherings, and then lo and behold, COVID spread, and a number of younger people now are facing, some pretty severe health consequences from, again, assuming that because they were in a demographic, they were safe. That's what I mean by rolling the dice.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're always we're having to do sort of a cost benefit analysis on various things. Like, for instance, I have a condition known as an autoimmune known as ankylosing spondylitis. And so I'm on Cosentex right now, which makes you a little bit more vulnerable to such things. But prior to COVID, years ago, I was on Humira or Enbrel, and that raises certain risks for you, in particular of, let's say, like getting tuberculosis or something. And I went on a number of missions trips on planes and stuff like that, knowing that going to other countries, I was in India, I was in other places, that I could, be exposed to something, but you weigh that risk. And so how would you respond to that kind of idea, or that sort of how people have to weigh, living life and also not harming themselves and also others?
Right. Well, for example, I would say in your situation, where I see differences are, we have a good understanding of what the risks are if you, for example, contract tuberculosis. we understand what circumstances you're most likely to contract tuberculosis, and so you can avoid those circumstances. But for COVID-19, we just simply don't understand enough about the disease for people, I think, to make actually informed decisions on a cost-benefit analysis. And again, because of the way COVID-19 spreads, as Sandra is saying, because people are asymptomatic and they can spread the disease, because again, you could spread it to other people. I think that cost-benefit analysis not only has to apply to you, but it also has to apply to other people that you're going to be interacting with. And so you're now assuming that they are willing to incur risks on your behalf that they may not be willing to incur. So the impact of your decision isn't just for you.
So a key concept you stated there, or a key issue here that makes this unique for us, is how we're walking through, how we're learning what it is, how to deal with it. So there's in philosophy, we call it an epistemological issue, how much we actually know and how to deal with it. Whereas other issues, other diseases or problems, we know a bit more, so we can make that cost-benefit analysis. And I don't just mean that in a economic way. I mean that more in a human way.
Yeah. Well, you're bringing up some really good questions, George, and I think it's a good time to kind of pick your brain and get some of your answers to these questions concerning ethics. So we have a question here that comes in from a correspondent, and they said, an ungodly vaccine being forced on mankind by ungodly globalists. It's blasphemous to say our creator has a hand in such darkness. So again, this is going back to a response to Fuzz's blog article, where he's talking about the timing of the vaccine and how it was providential. So how would you respond to this concern that, first of all, God had no hand in the vaccine, and that the vaccine is really, it's ungodly, and it's forced upon us by ungodly globalists?
Right. Yeah, that was, of course, it was formed more as a statement than a question, right? So it has a certain texture to it, you might say. Mm-hmm. My first response is Fuzz wrote the article, so he should probably answer it. But obviously there's some assumptions there. An ungodly vaccine, right? Well, and Fuzz, please correct me if I misstate this. You have technology, but then you also have the intention behind developing the technology. You also have the intention or motive in how one uses the technology. So it's a little bit, in philosophy we call, or logic, you could call this it's a false dichotomy, right? The vaccine is either bad or it's good. It's not good, therefore it's bad. But there might be a third option, which means that it's amoral, it's neutral morally. Even though the intention in developing vaccines were good intentions to help people. So one might say that the technology is neutral, but how we use it, how we implement it, our intentions in doing that. You can have good intentions, but a misapplication, right? And the technology could still be morally neutral, but you can evaluate the intentions and the application of it. So I think the intentions behind the vaccines are intended for the common good. And now, of course, the person is stating things about so-called globalists and things like that. Just a quick comment on this. What I find is that people will say something online that they wouldn't say to you normally, kind of face-to-face, or like when I'm in a class with someone. And I can engage them with a clarifying question. It reminds me of driving in Southern California. When you are in a car, somehow you feel shielded, and people will do things. Sandra, when she's cut off, she has cards that say, "Bless you, brother, I'm praying for you," and things like that. But we do things sometimes. There's road rage, and we might say something that we wouldn't normally say to a person face to face. And I think that happens here in some of these comments, and it's not helpful. It doesn't progress us in the conversation and in understanding. And I should probably turn it over to Fuzz. And he talked about the creator or God having a providential, I think it was his words, a providential hand in this, so that God can have, with his foreknowledge and the way he sets up things and the way he interacts with human persons, technologies and certain things can have a providential place in our human history so that certain things come about at the right time and the right place. And God uses human beings to do some of this. Is that kind of what you're saying, Fuzz, or am I mischaracterizing it?
Well, but
that's
you answer, but before you answer, Fazale, I want to kind of clarify why you're saying that it's providential for those who haven't read the blog article, because you're talking specifically about the timing of the mRNA, well, of COVID, and then mRNA developments for vaccines that they were at the beginning of the onset of COVID. So if you can explain kind of the history behind the mRNA vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, to me, why I say I think it's providential is because, you know, when you look at the history of the COVID-19 vaccine development, it was literally at the point where the researchers were looking to progress messenger RNA vaccines into human clinical testing at the very point in time when the pandemic hit. And because of that confluence of factors, researchers were literally within days of having the gene sequence for the spike protein able to essentially develop a messenger RNA vaccine for COVID-19 and progress it almost instantaneously into animal testing and simultaneously into human testing. And so if this pandemic had hit a few years earlier, we would not be nearly as prepared to respond as quickly with a vaccine. So I see this as really, you know, part of God's providential timing that, you know, that the pandemic hit at that right point in time. So that's why I would say it's providential. But the idea that, you know, the vaccine, just to build off of comments that you made, George, the idea that the vaccine is being deployed on a global basis is actually necessary because the pandemic is a global pandemic. And so to call it a globalist agenda seems to me to be a bit unfair, because how else are you going to deploy the vaccines if the pandemic is impacting people around the world? Of course, it's going to be a global, you know, distribution of the vaccine, and it's going to be a global effort in terms of developing the vaccine and then figuring out how to fairly, again, make sure people all over the world have access to the vaccine. To conflate that need with some kind of globalist agenda, I think, is a bit unfair.
Thank you for that, Fuzz. I think I had the privilege of reading your article, so I know kind of the history behind the research for mRNA vaccines. Can you explain, though, how why there was already so much work done on mRNA vaccines so that once COVID-19 hit, all they had to do was sequence the genome? Like, people might suspect that, well, why was there work done for something that hadn't yet existed? So can you explain the use of mRNA vaccines?
Yeah, well, I mean, the concept behind messenger RNA vaccines has existed for easily 30 years. And the reason why people conceived of vaccines of this type is that they recognize that these would, in a sense, constitute the ideal vaccine. That once you could develop a messenger RNA vaccine where you have, you know, all the components and the vaccine will work. Once you develop the vaccine for one viral pathogen, it'll in principle work for every viral pathogen, or at least for most viral pathogens. And that means that you could then very rapidly develop the vaccine within months of a new viral pathogen being introduced into the human population, and that you could very quickly produce the vaccine in large quantities. And so it has many properties that make it ideal, which is why people have been pursuing these vaccines for 30 years. And in the early days, there are some very serious and significant technical problems that took decades to work through. And so it wasn't that people just rolled out of bed and threw these components into a test tube and had a vaccine. It was literally 3 decades in the making, where along the way there were some very critical breakthroughs that took place that allowed the technology to progress to the next level and the next level. At the point that the pandemic hit was at the point when we were progressing these messenger RNA vaccines into clinical studies, phase 1 and phase 2 clinical studies for Zika and for Ebola, and maybe for some other viral pathogens as well. And so because we already had, again, some safety data, because there was already that vaccine developed, all you had to do was swap out one messenger RNA sequence for another to make it specific for the SARS-2 coronavirus. So to me, it's eerie that the pandemic hits just at that point in time when we were already having this ideal vaccine at the point of fruition, rather than going into a large-scale phase 3 clinical study.
Yeah, and I think that's very helpful, because I've seen a lot of comments of like, this is something that they whipped up in 6 months, and I don't trust it because it's a brand new thing from 6 months ago. So I think that helps kind of show all of the decades worth of research and testing to lead up to this point of just replacing that genome from saying, right?
Yeah, and just, and that's a common question, rightfully so, people are concerned because of the rapid development. But again, that 30 years was not only working out the technology, but it was also making sure that the vaccine was safe, that they were addressing issues in terms of the development of the vaccine to ensure that it was, again, safe. So it was both effectiveness and safety considerations that were in that 30 years of development. And there was already some safety data developed for these types of vaccines with respect to other pathogens. So yes, it was fast tracked, but it was not done, again, in a vacuum. So to me, when I understood how long and how detailed the development of messenger RNA vaccines has been, at that point, I felt very comfortable, with the technology.
Right. Well, that leads to the next question then, which has to do with kind of the testing and its safety for particularly the elderly. So this question here says, to me, there is no tunnel. The recovery rate does not justify using an experimental vaccine, and the very elderly with comorbidities are the most vulnerable, but their weak immune systems will struggle to produce antibodies for the vaccine. And then kind of a second part to that brings up the limited testing because exclusionary criteria, that it didn't include elderly and people with comorbidities, and that we're now seeing participants with allergic reactions to vaccines that were included in the trials. So we're seeing anaphylactic reactions almost daily as real people are receiving the vaccine. So how would we begin to tackle that?
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe understand what was involved in the phase 3 clinical trials. So in both the Pfizer-BioNTech and then the Moderna trials, one of them involved, the Pfizer-BioNTech involved about 45,000 people, the Moderna about 30,000 people. And they were split into 2 groups. One group received a placebo, the other group received the vaccine. And they were in both cases, were given 2 doses of the vaccine. With Moderna, again, it was a 15,000 split. Now, the study groups included elderly people. So to say that the elderly people were not included is not actually true. In fact, there was enough data to show that the effectiveness rate for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for people over 64 years of age was 95%. Okay, and so these would be people that would have aging immune systems. There's to say that there weren't elderly people is not true. There were elderly people. And what they mean by 90% or 95% effective is, like, for example, in the Pfizer-BioNTech study, what they did is they inoculated people and then had them go out, live their lives normally. And then they would monitor who in that group got COVID. And of that group, 170 people got COVID, 160 were people that received the placebo, 10 people were received essentially the actual COVID vaccine. So from that basis, they calculated whatever it is, about a 90% effectiveness rate, slightly higher than 90% effectiveness rate. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, in these clinical studies, you're not going to include people that have severe reactions to vaccines for safety issues. That would be unethical to do a clinical study when you knew somebody is going to be susceptible to potentially anaphylactic shock. Now that you're deploying it into larger populations, anaphylactic shock, which is the chief risk of these vaccines, at least in the short term, you are going to see, anaphylactic shock, but the rate is incredibly low. It's 1 in 100,000 people, and the anaphylactic shock happens within 20 to 30 minutes of receiving the vaccine. So when people receive the vaccine, they have to wait for a period of time before they are released, and you can treat the anaphylactic shock immediately. As of now, I think there's maybe been about 40 million people vaccinated. And so, again, the rate for anaphylactic shock is about 1 in 100,000. So, of course, we're going to see people getting anaphylactic shock on a daily basis. But these are isolated cases. This is not a large-scale problem. So that the information that was undergirding those questions, or the assertions in those two questions, really is not, again, good information.
Yeah.
Can I make a point here, Sandra?
Sure.
And Fuzz, maybe you should comment on it. There's something here, sort of how we think and how we reason about these things. There's kind of an intellectual issue or problem and an emotional problem or issue. And though we're complex human beings, both are at play. You've done a lot of the study, so your intellectual confidence is probably higher, raises. Others, with the advent of also social media and things like that, they're seeing different kinds of stories come out, and they might hyper-focus on, people having a reaction to that. But as you say, it's really small. And so I think there's an emotional side to this. And let me give one example, and I use this in logic class. If I look at the drug that I take, Cosentyx, or take Enbrel or Humira, if you start to look at the potential side effects, a lot of them, it looks horrific. You can get cancer, you can do all this. And emotionally, you could start to become afraid and go, I don't want to take this. But that has to be mitigated with the intellectual side saying, but how many people really are affected by this? And like when I would have a conversation with my doctor, she said, well, your quality of life is going to increase and the risk is so really low. But if I allow my emotions to rule the day, I can get very hyper-focused on reading that list of potential side effects. Does that make sense?
It does. And, the thing is that, we know going into administering the vaccines that if somebody has a history of having strong allergic reactions, they are advised against taking the vaccine, right? Right. We're not going to administer the vaccine at this point to young children because we have no safety data on that, for what it does with young children. Here in the Los Angeles area in Southern California, there was in a 24-hour period of time, 10 recorded instances of anaphylactic shock, and people very quickly traced it to a particular lot of the Moderna vaccine, and they literally impounded that lot and they destroyed the lot. They know because they were concerned that something happened in the manufacture that actually enhanced the risk of anaphylactic shock. So people are monitoring what's happening on an ongoing basis. So even though there are these potential side effects, they try to understand them and put in place procedures and mechanisms to ensure that even when there are these severe reactions, we're able to effectively treat them. But these, again, it's tragic to be certain, but this is just the nature of medicine. Every medical procedure, every drug that we would take has certain risks associated with it, where certain people are not going to tolerate those procedures. That's just a risk going in. And so it's really, again, because those risks are so low, you proceed with the procedure, or you take the medicine, because again, it can improve the quality of your life or protect your life.
So I want to jump to you, George, quickly to talk about the ethical question of, well, whether it's ethical for people or corporations to own patents on vaccines. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I really want to hear what Fuzz has. He worked for, was it Procter & Gamble, Fuzz? So I'm interested in your thoughts. I think we want to have a place where we can raise these questions. But if we want to ask a hard question, we have to be able to, or be willing to stick around for the long answer sometime. And this gets into a lot of, complex situations. But patents, at least arguably, are important because, they help safeguard inventions. They can protect a product, a design, and a process that meets certain specifications. And it goes to one's originality and one's utility, creativity in creating these things. And in most cases, patents help people protect their intellectual property. We talk about having rights, property rights, and I know people raise questions about that, but we can talk about intellectual rights. We can talk about bodily rights. So there's a long history of why we've had patents that's important to go into. And I think to some degree we use that to incentivize creativity with rewards. And part of that is to appeal to people's willingness to be creative and be rewarded for that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that specific arrangement. However, in this case, many people kind of wonder whether the current system, and Fuzz can probably comment more particularly on this, but as one person wrote, we wonder whether or not this current exclusive rights system is the best way to incentivize research and pay for it. And they said if pharmaceutical companies are focusing on what, at least as I know it, blockbuster items that have a high profit, a lot of people could benefit from it, and it's used over and over, they may not be focusing on other issues that are less profitable, like pandemic preparedness or things like that. So some have raised the issue that there's whole areas of research that are neglected because certain companies turn their attention or focus to these blockbuster items. And so, but we might also be able to appeal to not just personal virtues, but sort of company virtues. I know of one company, you may be familiar with it, AbbVie. They gave up their global intellectual property rights for a potential treatment known as, I think it's Colertra or that. And so I think patents, again, patenting something is a tool, again, that we can use or we can misuse. And it's a means to providing rewards for people. But we certainly can ask questions on whether or not our current system is doing the most common good that we want it to. How would you respond to that also, Fuzz?
That was a very good response, George. And one thing I would add is that when I worked at Procter & Gamble, we would patent a lot of our, quote unquote inventions. But there were certain things we wouldn't patent. These were called trade secrets. And the thing is with a trade secret is that something that you're holding internally where you have that knowledge and nobody else has, which means that you as a company can benefit exclusively from that, though you're not really protected. Your secrets are not technically protected by law. But it also means that because that insight is not publicly available, nobody else can use that and leverage that insight to build the next generation of technology. So when it comes to patents, there's kind of a trade-off where you agree to disclose the art behind your invention so that everybody can learn from that and then use that for the next generation of inventions. But in exchange, you're then given certain exclusivity to enjoy the benefits of creating that technology for a period of time before the patent then expires, and then it becomes public domain. So patents are always for a finite period of time. Now, when it comes to something like, like let's say these messenger RNA vaccines, there were companies that were investing decades and decades of work in developing these things where they saw no return on that investment. And so by patenting the invention and then allowing them to have some limited monopoly in the market, it allows them to recoup that cost of developing that technology. But in exchange, they are disclosing to people how that technology works. So it's really trying to create a win-win, and as you say, to incentivize new inventions, but also to create an environment where the technology can continue to advance because of, again, an openness to disclose information about the technology and to share that information even with competitors. So I think it's a good system. In this case, with these vaccines, the governments were working in collaboration with private companies, to try to accelerate the development of the vaccine, again, for the common good, right? And so there were governments that were taking orders for vaccines even before the vaccines were completely developed to ensure that there was a profitability for these companies to pursue this work, again, for the sake of the greater good. So in this case, I don't see anything really unethical where, the governments are coming in and they're offsetting the cost of the vaccines so that individual people aren't having to absorb those costs themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Buzz. We've got still plenty more questions here. So I want to hop over to another George question. So one of the questions that we received, and I've heard this a lot, is that the vaccine has a microchip that can track us. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the first thing you want to ask is, where did you get the information, and is the information reliable where you got it? I think, in my philosophy class, I talk about different kinds of skepticism. There's sort of a common sense skepticism where you develop this so you don't get duped by incredible claims. Like if Sandra ran into my office and said, there are giraffes in the RTB parking lot, it's not logically impossible that there are giraffes there, but it's highly improbable, highly unlikely. So I have a sort of common sense skepticism. On other issues, our skepticism gets raised for various kinds of reasons. And in this case, in the microchip case, my skepticism becomes deeper because I just don't know where. I would want to see the information where people are getting this from, and what would be the motives. And I know sometimes what gets planted in our minds today is we see a movie or a show that they're sort of like thought experiments about these things, and they get sort of implanted into our consciousness, our memory. And so again, here, this might be an emotional reaction to where we're like, oh my gosh, are people actually moving forward with something like this? And what is their intentions? Do they have evil intentions? And one of our colleagues, Ken Samples, who's also a philosopher and theologian, he talks about the golden rule of apologetics. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of being charitable to people, even in your skepticism, trying to figure out what the justification is here. And so I think you can have skepticism, yet also that golden rule of trying to be charitable. Don't automatically think that there's something evil at play here. But Fuzz, what's your info on this idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is some, legitimacy behind the concern about microchipping, including microchips in the vaccine, because there is this proposal on the table about incorporating what are called quantum dots into vaccines. These microscopic particles that would react to light that would give a record of what kind of vaccines that you actually had received. And so you could incorporate that technology into these vaccines. There's no indication that this is the case right now, and there's no real reason to do that. But that's really where that concern arises, and of course it gets into issues of privacy and in that type of thing that people are concerned about.
Well, on the subject of privacy, oh, go ahead, George.
Well, you may be going in this direction, Sandra. I think people are becoming more savvy. I teach a class on ethics and big data or big data analysis, and how should we collect data, how long should we save data, how should we use data, how should we sell, all that sort of stuff. And part of the issue here is that I think people start to get more savvy. They start to learn, like, oh, well, my phone's tracking all these different sorts of things. Do I want it to do that? And sometimes your imagination go, well, what purposes are they using that for? And so we find this happening in other areas of our life. And if people have seen the social, what's it called, Sandra, the social dilemma? Social dilemma. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did a video on that. You start to become more savvy to this and saying, well, people are collecting all this information. Do I want them to? Do I not want them to? And I think this is getting raised in what you're saying here about the microchip. There's lots of other background information that's going on.
Right. And so one of the things going on in the background is not only that it will microchip us, but also that there are concerns about the vaccines being mandatory. So I'll read the question here. Do you think that vaccines should be mandatory? Typically, medical decisions allow for individual choice to opt in or opt out. What are the implications of opting out of the vaccine? Will it only hurt the individual, or is there a wider implication for the herd? George, you want to take this?
Well, I can start and raise some broader issues, and maybe Fuzz can speak to the more particulars and the science aspect of it. But I think the concern here is, notice how we deal with children. There's a level of parents, we call it paternalism. But paternalism for children does not necessarily transfer to adults, right? Adults, we might say, have actualized, or they possess more decision-making capacity. So the state may have a general duty to protect the vulnerable. I think we can talk about that, and a mandate of a vaccine could be plausible. But I think the worry here, and I think it's a fair worry, is are we allowing the state or others to be too paternalistic with us, allowing too much control? So there are various kinds of mandates that we do that we've become comfortable with. I think this one, there's just a bit more mysteriousness, and we're worried about that paternalism. Would you say that's true, Fuzz?
Yeah, I think so. And to me, I think the idea of kind of a universal mandate to get the vaccine, I think sits very, very uncomfortably with a lot of people. But I could easily see if-then mandates that make a lot of sense. So if you want to travel, then you must have record of being vaccinated, right? You might, call it the vaccine passport, right? And that to me, makes sense, because really traveling by air or by train or by bus is not necessarily a right, but it really is a privilege, right? And so if you want to enjoy that privilege, then, for good reasons, you must be vaccinated, because it's going to mitigate the likelihood of you spreading COVID-19 into other areas, that type of thing, or putting people that have to work, in the airline industry at risk, because you haven't been vaccinated, or, if you want to enter a particular store, that the store could require that, again, customers are vaccinated. Stores require people to wear masks. And so, this is something that they're doing to protect their employees. They're doing it to protect other customers and to create a safe environment. So I think the if-then mandates, to me, make a lot of sense. But I think a universal mandate is really going to be very uncomfortable, I think, for most people.
Yeah, and if you can, and I don't know, we might disagree on this portion, but we can talk about that. If you kind of look at a spectrum, and if you go towards one side and you want to reduce risk, you want more safety, more security. If you fall off the edge over there, you're worried about totalitarianism and too much government control or control in a single person or something like that. But the more you want security and less risk and safety, you're going to have to give up more liberties. But if you go on the other part of the spectrum and you want more liberty, more freedom, you're going to increase risk. And so, and you might be worried at the very edge that that much liberty leads to anarchy, but really the more liberty and freedom you have, the more you give up that safety and security. So there's a trade-off there. I don't know if you can perfectly have both. I haven't seen a model that provides that. So somewhere on that scale, we have to work towards and find some type of balance, and we have to talk about our values behind that. Do we tend to value more freedom and liberty, or do we tend to value more security, less risk, and those kinds of things? So those are discussions that I think what's happening is that people normally haven't had to weigh all those different ideas and think about them and address them in their life, but we're having to do it more now, and it creates dissonance. And we're looking for harmony, for a resolution to that. So it is, as you said, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, and some of it is maybe more cultural than it is actually ethical, if I may say that. So certain cultures where it's more community-oriented versus individual-oriented, kind of having mandates is probably that again promotes the common good, if you want to say that. And promotes security more broadly speaking, may be viewed as perfectly fine, culturally fine, and not threatening, because again, it's more of a community-oriented culture. In cultures that are more individualistic, like we see in the United States, the idea of losing liberties in exchange for security is probably a very uncomfortable idea, and that isn't necessarily something that's endemically ethical or unethical. It's more cultural. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think what you do there is you're switching to what ethicists talk about as descriptive ethics, and that fits within the field of sociology, anthropology. This is what people in fact do. This is what they are comfortable with, or have been, or will be. But it doesn't provide the prescription what we should do. Should we want a certain amount of liberty and freedom for people? What is that balance? And should we want this level of community? You might call it communitarian ethics. And so it's difficult. We have pushed individual rights very, very far, almost to where it makes things completely, almost morally relative for people, the way it's been implemented. Other times, I think if you look at the biblical aspect, there's a communitarian part, to a relational part to our ethic that is important. So I think what we need to do is provide a prescription, and that somehow takes into account our character, the commands God has given, but also to look at appropriate consequences, the common good, as you mentioned. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do. Ethicists try to work hard on integrating those things, but it's not a very easy thing to do.
It very much reminds me of Captain America Civil War with Iron Man and Captain America and those two decisions. So maybe like fellow comic book fans who are watching can go, oh yes, now I see the distinction and what the decisions look like and the consequences. There are pros and cons to kind of both sides. So it's hard to pick a side when we think about what we can do and what we should do.
Yeah, and there's also, it may be the case that this is why I'm a little skeptical of it. If you mandate vaccines and that, we might find, at least empirically, that it may lead to a reduction in vaccination rates. People might react negatively to it. And so some of this is hard to know without, practicing and experimenting, but, I want to be cautious about, I'm open, but cautious.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We've got some more questions here, and I do want to dive into some of the questions, Fuzz, that are just about the actual science behind the vaccine and what it could potentially do, or how the vaccine could potentially affect people. So someone asks, does the COVID vaccine alter your DNA? And I've heard that before too. So I think that's a good question that we want to address.
Yeah, and the short answer to that is no. Neither the messenger RNA vaccines that we see from Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna will alter the DNA. The genetic material is messenger RNA. As soon as it gets into the cell, it basically will break down very quickly after it directs the production of the virus spike proteins. Mm-hmm. The vaccines developed by AstraZeneca, which has been approved in the UK and some other countries, or the new arriving Janssen vaccine. Janssen is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, is also an adenovirus vaccine similar to the AstraZeneca vaccine. These are vaccines that in principle could alter the DNA because they're using an adenovirus as the vector to carry the genetic material into the cell that directs the production of the spike protein that is triggering the immune response. But they have genetically altered the adenovirus so it can't replicate inside the cell and it can't incorporate into the DNA. So even in those cases, with those vaccines, there's still nothing to be worried about in terms of the vaccine altering our DNA.
Right. Thank you for that. I think there is a lot of worry, as you mentioned, just about the vaccine, and then the rumors that can come up. So one of them is that there are reports of Bell's palsy and horrible shaking and death as a result of the vaccine. And then Hank Aaron is given as an example. But what I found is I found some articles saying that his death was falsely linked to COVID. So again, we were running into this place where what you brought up, George, about sources and kind of checking our sources and stuff. But that's a concern that people have, is reports of Bell's palsy.
Yeah, and Bell's palsy is a condition that's caused by a viral infection. And so with the Moderna, Pfizer vaccines, or with the Moderna or the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines, which are messenger RNA vaccines, you're not introducing viral material into the individual. There's no way they're going to trigger Bell's palsy just from that standpoint alone. The AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccines also, there's no reason mechanistically to think they're going to trigger Bell's palsy because the adenovirus vector has been, again, modified in such a way that it can't replicate inside the cell. It can't incorporate its genetic material into the cell. Now, where the concern about Bell's palsy does have legitimacy is that in both the Moderna and the Pfizer BioNTech clinical studies, they noted in each study 4 individuals, so collectively 8 individuals developed Bell's palsy. Now, it's not clear to me whether those people that developed Bell's palsy were in the placebo group or in the group that actually received the vaccine dose. But if you look at the rate of Bell's palsy occurring in the population, if you took a sample of 75,000 people, about 8 people would develop Bell's palsy anyway. So the number of incidences of Bell's palsy in those clinical studies was no different than what you would expect in the population at large in terms of the rate of developing Bell's palsy. So this was noted as part of the results of the clinical study, but it looks like it's more of a correlation than a bona fide cause and effect. But this was reported with the idea that physicians can monitor, the vaccine, the people that are receiving the vaccines, and if we see a spike in Bell's palsy, then this is a reason to be concerned. So right now, no real concern for that. Again, there are people that do develop anaphylactic shock when they do receive the vaccine. And so that is, again, a real concern. Another side effect that you will have from the vaccine is after the vaccine, maybe several hours to a day afterwards, you might experience chills, shaking, fever, and this is actually a good thing. It means your immune system is kicking into action. It's responding and doing what it's supposed to do. These symptoms are short-lived, no more than 24 hours, and you're not actually getting sick. It's really the appropriate response on the part of your immune system. So I've heard anecdotally people that get the second dose have about a day where they're really down after that dose because of chills and fever. But again, this is a good thing. It's natural. It's what you would expect to happen. So maybe the reports of shaking are related to those naturally expected, side effects. The connection between Hank Aaron's death and the COVID-19 vaccine is really, again, very tenuous. He received the vaccine and he died 17 days later. All of the known side effects would be such that if he was going to die from anaphylactic shock, it would be within minutes or hours after receiving the vaccine, not 2.5 weeks later. It's just simply a coincidence. It's not, again, cause and effect. We're not seeing this on a widespread basis. If this was a real problem, we would be seeing this on a widespread basis, given that we've, again, have administered 35 million to 40 million doses of the vaccine.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to remember, I mean, we're in a pandemic. This is a scary time. And so people are on high alert and
Right.
they're going to be worried. They're going to be scared, and anything new is going to be, worrisome. And so I'm glad that we're addressing these questions and taking them seriously. We want to address these questions carefully and with kindness as well. Another question that has come in concerning possible side effects is that the vaccine will make females of childbearing age sterile. And I heard that actually from a friend, and I'm like, okay, where's your source? So yeah, that is definitely a concern. I'm sure women who are of childbearing age don't want to be sterile unless they've chosen to. But yeah, so what are the concerns about that, and is it valid?
Yeah, well, most of these claims I can sort of understand where they've come from, where they're not totally outlandish claims in my estimation, where there's some basis in fact that maybe gets distorted and exaggerated, or the science isn't properly understood and properly carried to its logical consequence. This one is something that I cannot find why people would make that particular assertion, because in my understanding, there's no connection between any kind of vaccine and sterility in males or in females of childbearing age. So I don't know why these vaccines would be singled out. And the thing is, there's no way that you could even know that, because the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine have existed for only 6 months. So that's not long enough to be able to assess whether receiving the vaccine is going to cause sterility or not. There's just not enough time to make that assessment one way or the other. But mechanistically, there's no reason to think that these vaccines would cause, again, sterility. They're not going to modify the DNA in any of the cells in our body. And so because of that, you would not expect them, for that basis alone, to cause sterility. So I just don't really know, where that comes from. Now, one thing that we should make note of here, and that is that there has been no safety data generated whatsoever for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding in terms of whether they should receive the vaccine. Now, there's no reason, to my knowledge, to think that these vaccines would be unsafe for pregnant women or for women who are breastfeeding, but we just don't have safety data. So if you are in those two groups, you may want to consult seriously with your physician. But keep in mind also, women that are pregnant actually are much more vulnerable to COVID-19 than women that are not pregnant. So the pregnancy is considered, in this case, a comorbidity, which can lead to a much more severe outcome if you do develop COVID-19. So pregnant women really need to be careful about contracting COVID-19.
Right. Okay. So that's good. That's helpful to hopefully address that concern. Another concern, and sorry, George, we'll get to you in a little bit, but Fuzz.
I'm fine with being a fly on the wall. It's fun anyway.
So one of the questions that came in, it's a little long, so I'm going to read the whole thing just to make sure we get the whole context. It says all past attempts at making a vaccine for SARS viruses followed the same path in animal trials. Immediately upon receiving the vaccine, the animals demonstrated a very robust antibody immune response. But in every case when the animals were eventually exposed to the wild virus, they had an enhanced immunity response, previously called disease enhancement, where the animals became violently ill and or died. As a result, attempts at producing a SARS vaccine stopped until now. So what happened in the animal trials this time when they were exposed to the wild virus? They weren't. They were re-exposed to the vaccine. What will happen when people who receive the vaccine are eventually exposed to the wild virus? Nobody knows, but it may not be pretty. So how do we address that?
Yes, and so this is a concern that has been increasingly raised. I'm seeing it in a number of places, and it has to do with a phenomena called antibody-dependent enhancement, or as you mentioned, immune enhancement or disease enhancement. And there are scientific studies done, as this questioner points out, where people were looking to develop vaccines against SARS and against MERS, both of which are coronaviruses. And they noted that while they were trying different types of vaccines in animals, that what ended up happening is after receiving the vaccination, the animals were actually more susceptible to SARS and MERS as opposed to actually protected from SARS and MERS. And so this is scientifically established to be certain. So the concern is, because SARS-2 coronavirus is also a coronavirus, could that same phenomena happen? Well, this idea that this was not tested in animals is not true, because there were animal studies done by Pfizer, BioNTech, as well as Moderna, as well as AstraZeneca. They did not skip animal studies. And there were papers published in the last few months during the course of vaccine development that was reminding people that this is a concern for the development of safe and effective vaccines. So it was not as if the scientists developing these vaccines were unaware of this particular phenomena. Well, it turns out that this is a phenomena that, I'm going to get a little technical here, that it seems to be associated with viruses whose genetic material is plus-strand RNA, which again includes coronaviruses. So this is a generalized phenomena. And it turns out that what ends up happening is that if the antibodies that are produced are not produced at high enough levels, or if the binding of the antibody to the virus is a weak binding, or if it's binding what's called an epitope, a region of the virus that is not directly involved in the mechanism for the virus gaining entry into the cell, what ends up happening is that the antibody coating of the virus actually creates another pathway for the virus to get into the cell. And then there's two or three different pathways the viruses can take into the cell when they are decorated with antibodies that are weakly binding or binding at low levels or binding, again, to the wrong type of epitope, if you will. And what happens is that means that instead of the vaccine actually conferring immunity, it actually makes the organism more vulnerable to the infection. And so if there's alternate pathways for the virus to get into cells, that means it's more likely for that infection to be severe, the response to that viral infection to be much more severe. But people noted in these earlier studies that if they were targeting the spike protein in the coronavirus, this ADE phenomena, this antibody-dependent enhancement, was actually mitigated. It was not nearly as severe. And so when we look at the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines as well as the adenovirus vector vaccines, these vaccines are designed to produce very high levels of spike proteins that then are going to elicit an immune reaction. So it's going to be a very strong immune reaction. It's going to be producing antibodies that are going to bind very tightly to the spike protein. And because it's targeting the spike protein, which is central to the entry of the virus into the cell, none of those three criteria that are met that lead to, again, immune enhancement or this antibody-dependent enhancement. So there's no reason to think intrinsically that these vaccines are going to lead to this ADE type of phenomena. This idea that people were not exposed to the real virus is not true, because in the clinical studies, again, people received either a placebo or they received the actual vaccine. They were then out living their lives as they normally would, and they were exposed to the real vaccine. And the people that contracted COVID, again, most of them were in the placebo groups. Over 90% were in the placebo group. 10% or less were actually in the group that received the vaccine. But of those people that contracted COVID, none of them showed any indication that the disease was enhanced, right? And so you could make this determination, again, from the clinical studies. That's enough data out there. Also, now that we've got 35 doses that have been administered, people that receive these doses are, again, being exposed to the real life vaccine, and we see no evidence of disease enhancement. So this is a legitimate concern. The scientific community was well aware of this concern. This was factored into the vaccine development. It was factored into the animal testing, to the safety testing. This is what the FDA evaluated as they sought to grant emergency approval to these vaccines. So again, a concern to be certain, but it's not a concern that I think is bearing out.
Right. And thank you for that. I think you addressed a second question that I was going to ask about ADE. So thank you for that. We have 3 more questions. So we're ready, guys? We're kind of rounding third, or I was going to say fourth. That's home. Okay. We're almost done here, guys. Okay. So let me ask this question then. And it's again directed at you, Fuz. It says, I've been hearing from many other sources that, like many other vaccines, this one uses fetal cell lines from an aborted fetus, or many aborted fetuses. And it says, I admittedly don't understand too much about that. So can you elaborate on that? And first, I just want to say, I love that this person said they don't know much about it. That's a great way to ask a question when you're curious and you want an answer. It's just, right. I don't know. So that was helpful.
Well, for people that hold to a pro-life position, this is a very serious question. And this is why I'm so grateful that George is helping us take on some of these questions today. And so let me just simply lay out the science behind how the vaccines were developed and how they are going to be manufactured. The Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine, which again are both messenger RNA vaccines, did not require the use of human cells, for the development, or they will not require the use of human cells for their manufacture. They did require the use of human cells for what are called confirmatory tests to make sure that the vaccine actually led to the production of spike proteins in human cells. So there was limited amount of testing where human cells were used. For the viral vector vaccines, these required the use of human cells for the development, for the confirmatory testing, and will require the use of human cells for ongoing production. So this would be AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccine, which again will be available in the US probably within a few months. Now, the cells that are used belong to a cell line called HEK293. And HEK stands for human embryonic kidney cells. So they were derived from human embryonic kidney cells. HEK stands for human embryonic kidney cells. And the cell line was created by a researcher in the Netherlands who took fetal cells from the kidney of a human fetus after an elective abortion. This abortion happened in 1972, again in the Netherlands, and was a single abortion that took place, in which, again, this researcher harvested these human embryonic kidney cells, then took those cells and treated them with an adenovirus to essentially immortalize the cells, which means that these cells would continue to reproduce over and over and over again. They would proliferate indefinitely because of essentially intentional chromosomal damage done to the cells. They also did other things to the cells to make them grow well in suspension, to make them produce more protein and things like that. So these would become an ideal human cell model for research and development or for manufacturing purposes. But once the cell line was developed and cloned, the cells essentially are generated on an ongoing basis. They don't require, again, an ongoing extraction of cells from fetal tissue to sustain the cell line. Once the cell line is there, the cell line again is an immortal cell line. These cells are used practically universally in biomedical research. So probably most drugs that we take have been tested in terms of their toxicity and their safety profiles with these types of cells. These cells are used to produce proteins that are used in biomedicine, and so they're widely used. So yes, indeed, these cells were, again, generated from an abortion, but again, it was a single abortion that happened 50 years ago. You do not need fetal cells that are on an ongoing basis to be isolated from, again, abortions for the development or for the production of these vaccines. And so this now leads us to some kind of, I think, some very complex ethical questions, because you're not technically using, again, fetal cells, but you're using cells that have been derived from fetal cells and then have been propagated for 50 years, right? And so, just a couple of really quick points I think that are worth making, and then I'd love to hear George interact. But what is the immoral act if you're a pro-life person would be the original abortion. The actual isolation of the cells is a secondary act, and then turning those cells into a cell line is really a tertiary act. And then, of course, propagating the cells is a quaternary act after the fact. And so the further away you are from the actual immoral act, I think the less immoral the actions become, right? The second thing is that that it's not unusual for us to benefit from immoral actions. So the examples that I've seen cited by, for example, Catholic bioethicists and Protestant bioethicists who hold to a pro-life position as they deliberate about this particular issue, is that, for example, the railroads in the United States were built with slaves. They were built by Chinese immigrants who were horrifically exploited. So does that mean that anytime you get on a train that you are somehow complicit in slavery or human exploitation? Does that mean that you're actually condoning those immoral acts? Or, for example, the drug that's used to treat malaria, hydroquinone, is actually was developed by the work done by Nazi scientists on Jews in concentration camps. So does that mean every time a doctor is prescribing this anti-malarial medication that he is somehow complicit in what was happening in the concentration camp? So the larger principle here is that many times, immoral acts actually lead to good fruits. And you could even see from a biblical perspective that those good fruits represent a type of redemptive action that kind of doesn't justify, but kind of mitigates the evil that has been done or turns that evil into good. And then the last point would be that by not receiving these, by not developing and not receiving these vaccines, there's also harm that's done, by the disease, by COVID-19, where we've talked about the human pain and suffering and the death toll that we're incurring. And so by not receiving the vaccine for pro-life considerations, are you actually creating other harm? Are you causing other pain? Are you causing pain and suffering elsewhere? So the common good is also something that needs to be considered as we determine, again, what are the ethics associated with these vaccines. So this is a really muddied area, I think, where I personally don't see these vaccines as being unethical from a pro-life perspective, but I can see why somebody might take a differing view.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Fuzz, for kind of unpacking that. George, it's your time to shine now. He's tossed a lot of questions your way.
Well, there might be some also clarifying issues. And one thing I would want to ask you, Fuzz, is scientifically, because it's not my area, could those cells that were developed from the elective abortion, could we have, or scientists, could they have ever collected those types of cells in another manner that would have been ethically or morally permissible? Or is this the only way that we could get those types of cells?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's and this is something that I'm still working through myself. One way to get cells that you could then immortalize is to take them from cancer, from tumors. Cells that are cancerous are very easy to immortalize. And so, for example, the HeLa cell lines that people use came from a woman named Helen Lane who had, I can't remember the particular cancer that she had, but those cells were developed, HeLa cells were developed from, again, a tumor. And there's a number of cell lines that are in play, that are used in biomedical research and in kind of production of vaccines and protein, biomedical products that again come from cells that were harvested from abortions. I think part of what's going on there is that fetal tissue, because it's not completely faded, that it's still in a developmental stage, actually is much more easy to immortalize than maybe cells that you would take from an adult, from adult tissue that have already been, where their fate has been finalized, if you will, during the course of development. That probably is the reason why people are taking these cells from embryos. And these different cells lines that are developed, it's kind of a hit and miss, where you're playing around with the cells, and then you wind up with these cell lines that have certain properties that make them ideally suited for certain applications as opposed to other applications. And so you kind of have a library of cell lines that you can choose from for biomedical research, depending on the question that you're trying to ask. And so there's all kinds of other factors going into this. So most likely, these HEK 293 cells have ideal properties. For example, they produce large amounts of protein. They grow very easily in suspension. We've got a long history of studying these cells, so we understand how these cells work. So anyway, that's probably why these cells were chosen.
To further go on that, but could those cells have been captured? Let's say we knew an unborn baby was going to be born, but we knew it would die for some reason. There could be a number of maladies that it would die from. Could you still get the cells? In that case, you're not intentionally, intention becomes involved here, not just the action. You're not intentionally killing the unborn or the newborn, but you're taking those cells from a natural death. We do this similarly when people volunteer, like the DMV, if you're in an accident, you can have donate your kidney or stuff like that. Could we have achieved those cells in a situation such as I described?
Yes, I mean that would be probably a much more ethical scenario, is that if it was a miscarriage and that you would then take the cells from the child that had miscarried. So I suspect that part of what you're looking at here was convenience, right? This researcher is looking at developing a number of different human cell lines for really probably noble purposes. These cell lines are going to then serve the research community. They're going to serve the medical community, in terms of drug development and things like that. So, and drug production. So, see, it was probably out of convenience. But, as I've read about, these cells, people make a very deliberate point of indicating that this was an elective abortion that took place independent of whether or not this researcher was going to harvest the cells or not. And so, in other words, his act of harvesting the cells was decoupled from the actual abortion, that the abortion wasn't motivated so to provide the fetus so that he could then isolate the cells, right?
Right. So yeah, there's the issue of intention there, and then how we benefited from the result. I mean, part of what I've heard you say is one of the issues is that this line has, would you say, about 50 years of development and things like that. So part of my point in asking those questions was, is there a way to hold to the moral framework of being pro-life, that the unborn are precious unborn human persons, and get that sort of information and development? And you seem to say, yes, there is. So I guess what I would say is that, okay, let's say your argument is right. That happened, but we have this development now. We're not contributing secondarily to promoting that evil or that immoral act or unjustified act. So how do we now find ways to do this in a just way, right? And I think that we have an opportunity here to talk about the truths and the facts that you just did, but it would be an opportunity to highlight the issue of abortion, human value, those types of things. Those questions could be raised. And this has happened with, if you do some, ethicists have done some work on what do we do with the information that was developed from those Nazi doctors in concentration camps. And many, including Jewish ethicists, think that no, some of that information is justifiably usable, but when we do that, there's certain ways that we handle that information by highlighting the evils or the unjustified acts that had happened, how we're not promoting that for the future. There are other means of finding this information now or developing from there. So you are using it in a redeemable way, but you're also highlighting so it stays within the consciousness, the memory of people. A recent study came out that the knowledge of World War II and the Holocaust has diminished, the broad knowledge. And so if things aren't being highlighted, we could forget about that. And what I want to avoid is making people instruments to do our bidding or to do other so-called goods. No, I want to keep the intrinsic value of the human person and find ways to treat them justly while achieving some of these grand purposes for the common good. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I appreciate that because, I'm a biochemist, I'm not a bioethicist. And so when, I began to really dig into this whole question of, what is the source of the cells and how should I think about these, the use of these cells for vaccine development or production, again, as a Christian who is pro-life and as well as, again, someone who is a scientist, I turn to, for example, Catholic ethicists, and the Vatican has the Pontifical Academy for Life, and they've actually issued some statements about, again, the COVID-19 vaccines. And, their point was very similar to your point, which is, look, this is, it's a tragedy that that this abortion happened, that they're not condoning, again, the development of the cell line, as a result of the abortion, but they recognize that cell line was developed, that it has great utility, and that given the situation that we're in, which is a pandemic, and that there's really no alternatives that we have that are less ethically problematic, that you are not necessarily condoning abortion by receiving the vaccine. And again, they would point out that it's, again, there's an eye towards the common good, that by not receiving the vaccine, you are making it harder to attain herd immunity, which then is just, continuing pain and suffering caused by COVID-19 is causing deaths as well. But then they call on the biomedical research community and pharmaceutical companies to actually look for alternatives, an alternative source of human cells that weren't connected to any kind of immoral act, which is, I think, the point that you're making. And so I think this discussion is really a good discussion because it is highlighting the fact that there was an evil that was committed, that we're not condoning that evil. But again, in a practical sense, it's either we have no vaccines and the pandemic persists, or we have vaccines that, again, have an ethical dark cloud hanging over their head, but nevertheless there can be good that can come from it. The use of these vaccines for good does offer some redemption, I think, for that evil act that was committed. And again, I'm not sure that I would say that the researchers that are using these cells, or the companies that are using the cells for production, 50 years later, are actually in any way, shape, or form engaging in unethical behavior, right? They're just simply making use of cells that are broadly available, that are widely used to achieve, hopefully a good end. So, this is really a very, very tricky problem. But I love your idea of, hey, let's make sure that we are highlighting the fact that there was an evil act that was committed, even if we are, benefiting from it, and there are good fruits that come from it. It doesn't justify the act, or in any way are we complicit in the act.
Yeah, and I think, and I know we're kind of running short on time here, but what people generally don't realize is that different ethicists, different people making comments on this, are using a different ethic, or what's called a normative ethical system, to make certain decisions. And some of that reasoning is can be problematic. Like if you are a utilitarian, one of the weaknesses, limitations, or big problems with that is that you can use someone as an instrument for the common good, because it creates a greater happiness or a greater benefit, or reduces suffering for the greatest amount of people. But at the same time, you could be violating and harming an individual in that process. And that seems unethical and unjustified. So we don't want to arguably, I don't know if it came from Augustine or who. Ken would probably know better than me, but we never want to use people and love things. We want to love people and use things.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that. That is a lot to kind of think about. And I think we can kind of continue talking about the ethical concerns. I saw George, who went like that, as he's thinking. I'm guessing that if you use any fetal cell lines, that George might say that is an ethical concern, period. And making it less so doesn't mean it's not something to be concerned about. So some people will still really be hesitant to take any vaccine that has used.
Well, I mean, and to your point, Sandra, I mean, this is a really challenging question, And so really our goal in this discussion, in fact, our goal in this entire, Q&A session was really to try to lay out information, and let people make their own decisions, based on the information we're providing. So the point is, we're not hopefully telling people what to think, but trying to give people the tools and the information so that they can make their own decision, but it's an informed decision.
Right. Thank you for that. So a couple more questions. Going back to the vaccine and its effectiveness, one of the questions, and now, of course, this was asked, I think, before this variant arrived here in the US, but it packed its little bags and it's here now. So they're asking if the COVID vaccine will protect us against the new variant. It says that appeared in the UK, but
right now I don't know that there's a really good answer. I think there is some indication that the existing vaccines will provide some level of protection against the variant, but not the level of protection that you would receive with regard to other variants that currently exist. So may not get a 90 to 95% protection. Maybe it might be a 50% or a 60% protection, which is still better than no protection at all. And so right now I saw that Moderna today said that they most likely would have to develop a booster, to give to people to essentially provide immunity for these new variants. So it may be that after you do your Moderna sequence that you may have to go back and get another boost. But this is one reason why herd immunity becomes so important, because as long as we have a large number of people being infected with COVID-19, the chance of new variants arising is greater and greater, right? So the sooner we get herd immunity, the less likely that these new variants are going to emerge. So this is going to be an ongoing problem, I predict, until we attain herd immunity.
Right. So I have a question concerning kind of the bigger topic that you address in your blog, and that is about this being providential. So a question that came in, and it's pretty lengthy. I'm going to just make it a little bit more succinct. They're asking about the Black Plague and the Spanish flu. So saying if this vaccine is attributable to God, and then the lack of inoculation for Black Plague and Spanish flu, is that also attributed to God? So kind of just saying, hey, if God did it this time, but he didn't do it last time, what happened? Like, are we, they end it by saying, it's like praising the arsonist firefighter for extinguishing the flames that they started.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that we need to unpack in response to this question. The first is that there are very good reasons why God would create a world where there are viruses, and there's very good reasons why God would create a world where there were viral pathogens that would affect animals. Number one, they would help to control, the numbers, is a way of controlling animal numbers, and through that maintaining healthy ecosystems, maintaining biodiversity and biomass on the planet. And so there are good reasons why God would create a world where there are viruses in it. And viruses even play a role in our health. Most of the viruses that exist in nature are benign to us. There's really a limited number of the total number of viruses that are actually human pathogens. And in almost every instance, those viruses were introduced in the human population through zoonotic transfer, where they hopped from an animal host to a human host. And the basis for that zoonotic transfer many times has to do with the fact that we've displayed either a lack of wisdom in terms of how we've interacted with the world around us, with creation, or that we have done things that have been maybe even on the point of being irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And so COVID-19 is not God's fault, but rather really we bear a responsibility because of, presumably the practice of having these wet markets in China, right? It's creating this breeding ground for viruses and and just begging for zoonotic transfers to take place. So to say that God is responsible for the outbreak of these different types of viral pathogens and these pandemics, I think is really improperly attributing responsibility to God when it really is human folly or maybe even human immorality that's causing this. And so when it comes to God's providential work in the world around us, it's very easy for us to see God's providential hand in our lives or in our circumstances because we see the just right thing happening in the just right time. And for those of us who see God at work in the world around us, we will attribute that again to God's providential care for us. And so I can clearly see that with the timing of where things were at with these messenger RNA vaccines. Now, when it comes to the Black Plague or the Spanish flu, it could very well be that God's providential hand was at work there, mitigating the spread and the extent and the pain and the suffering from those diseases. But at this point in time, looking back into history, I may not be able to discern or to see God's providential hand. So I don't know that we could say that God's providential hand wasn't actually present. So that's how I would respond to it. It's a legitimate question, I think, but I think it's making certain assumptions that I don't think are justified.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Fuzz. I got to tell you. Oh, go for it, George.
Oh, I just a couple of comments. I mean, a lot of Christian philosophers have worked on what we would call this as the problem of evil. And what Fuzz is kind of pointing to is separating the difference between the moral problem of evil and the natural problem of evil. And there could be, God can have morally justified reasons for permitting certain natural evils and for permitting even moral evils perpetrated by human beings, given free will and things like that. So I think the burden of proof is on the interrogator there to show that God doesn't have morally justified reasons for permitting some of these things. But also about the timing and talking about providence, just one thing, and maybe an illustration would help. God might dignify the image of God in us by helping us learn to understand his creation and learn how to love others in the process as he's redeeming us. So if, like as a parent, I don't do everything for my kid, but I dignify him as he or she matures so that they can then not only do it on their own, but they learn love, maturity, a whole host of things in that process. If I just solved it all for them, it would never dignify the nature that they have. And at least arguably, this could be an analogy that God dignifies the nature in us by allowing us to discover these things at different times, and that we would use it like a good creator would. We would use it to help others and not harm them. Would you agree with that, Fuzz?
Yeah, I think that's really, I think, again, a really good point. And, again, I would just simply go back to the fact that in absence of having historical details at my fingertips about the Black Plague or the Spanish flu, who's to say that God didn't exercise his providential care in ways that, again, are not evident to us, but would maybe be evident to people living at that time. So you're making, again, an assumption that God was somehow absent, right? But I think I mean, when you look at, the mandate that God gave to us as human beings in the Garden of Eden, which was to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue the earth and bring it under our control, and then to be caretakers of the planet, the idea was that we were to take the order that was in the Garden of Eden and spread that order around the world as we brought the world under our control. And that meant that God wasn't, as you're saying, just simply saying, here's, I've created a garden over the entire planet, but rather, here's the prototype. Now it's up to you to take that prototype and to develop an understanding and to grow and to learn, and in the process to bring the world under control. So in that sense, we become, if you will, co-creators with God, finishing off the work that he's done, which means that our knowledge is going to progress. Technology is going to advance over time. And that is just simply part of, again, how God is expecting us to engage in this process of bringing things under our control. But because we also have a broken relationship with God, that broken relationship not only impacts how we interact with God, but how we interact with others and how we interact with the creation. And it's out of that brokenness that instead of being good stewards of the planet, instead of being able to take the good things in the world and use it for good for us and good for, all life on the planet, many times, again, we engage in sinful acts or in acts of folly that prevent us from maybe achieving what God would have intended at a much more rapid rate. And so as a result of that, there is pain and suffering. And so, yes, indeed, it was a long process to get to the point where God's providence in this particular instance played out. But again, it's wrong to think that God wasn't providentially at work throughout that process in different ways at different times in human history, even in the midst of, again, these horrific catastrophes that really I think you can't lay at God's feet, but rather, again, at humanity's feet.
Kind of related to that, and this is our last question, but, it might take some discussing, just talking about human activity and how it's affected, well, where we are here with COVID-19. So to both of you, how would you respond to our motivation as Christians to love our neighbors during a time like this? What are we responsible to be doing right now? Or at least some thoughts, because we don't want to tell people you've got to do it this way, but what are some thoughts that you want to convey to those who are watching, who are Christian, who believe that we should be loving our neighbors? How can we do that and best demonstrate that to others? Let's start with you, Fuzz.
Well, I just think there are very simple things that we can do that I think can have a huge impact in terms of loving our neighbors. I think even the idea of properly wearing masks, making sure we're engaging in social distancing, being sensitive about putting other people at risk, these are things that we can do simply. I think, we should seriously entertain being vaccinated, even if we have some measure of discomfort, in my opinion, because, again, it not only protects us, but it protects others around us who are vulnerable. So those are ways in which we can love others. So I'm not saying that if you don't get vaccinated that you're not loving other people, but these are just my convictions. But also, this time has taken a very heavy psychological toll on people. It's taken an economic toll on people. And so just going out of our way to try to spend money at local businesses, restaurants, with the idea of, hey, what you're spending money here is helping to keep these businesses afloat, being sensitive to the needs of people in the community, maybe going out of our way to check in with people, even if it is remotely or through technology, but these are some practical ways that we can love others.
What do you think, George?
Yeah, I think also to play a different angle on it for those who are still wrestling with some of these issues and questions. Like, for instance, you can be a COVID realist, as we talked about at the beginning, and start to really understand the depth and the breadth of the issue. But you can be a skeptic about other policies and things like that, about how to do lockdowns, what is good, what is not, how long quarantines. And I think Christians should be some of the first. Jesus was really good at asking questions. In fact, in the garden, right after we sin, God doesn't come down. He asks a question is what he does in the beginning of them. And so I think we can have, be very good ambassadors for Christ by asking good questions, giving people some space to wrestle with these things. We don't get reconciled or have this harmony overnight. So I like what Fuz said about making yourself available to people. That I think that's really, really important. Thinking of others, as Paul says in Philippians 2, higher, better than yourself. Offering you whatever talents, gifts you have, making those available to others. Like you said earlier, I was a pastor for about 20 years, and when I teach, I notice how the struggles that my students were going through with all this transition and uncertainty. And so I would just offer to stay late after class and talk to them or set up other meetings with them, just to give them, I may not be their direct pastor, but I can be pastoral with them and encourage them and give them hope. So I think offering yourself is something that's really, really important. Being kind to people as they're wrestling with these issues. They're not easy, as Fuz said. And some of us have more time to read on these things, to explore them. And so helping people, being patient with them as they're wrestling with this. And, at RTB, we talk about doing it in gentleness and respect. We really got to get good at not just throwing bombs out there, but being respectful and gentle and helping people discover the truth. Because I want to put my arm around people and say, let's discover the truth together and have conversations on the way and not have an adversarial role. Right. Those are just great reminders and practical tips on how to really demonstrate love during this time. Thank you so much, guys. It was a long, but I think important conversation to have. And I hope that it has helped equip our viewers to, think through some of these questions and maybe answer some of their questions. And who knows, we might get more questions as a result. I suspect we will. So if you are watching and you have more questions, first be sure to check out Fez's blog. You can go to reasons.org and search for the Cells Design blog. But also you can connect with RTB on social media. So look for @RTB Official on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us there. And if you have questions, you can put them in there. And also, don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel and then be sure to hit the little bell so you get those notifications. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again.